Listen, if you're a film person, a new Paul Thomas Anderson movie is an event. There Will Be Blood, Phantom Thread, The Master. His movies are on so many greatest movies of all time lists. He's back with a brand new movie. It is called One Battle After Another. Critics are calling it one of his best films ever. I'm Elamin Abdelmahmoud, and this is Commotion. L. Jones is here. Jackson Weaver is here. Radheyan Simonpillai is here. Hello to all of you. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Hello.
I mentioned that it's like an event for film people. For Rad personally, this is like his WrestleMania. I mean, like every time that Paul Thomas Anderson comes out with a movie, Rad is like, clear the schedule, clear the month maybe for me to
Clear
just like
the year, clear the Oscar calendar, clear it all.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'm happy for you. Congratulations. There's a lot of characters in this movie, so we need to just sort of like contextualize just the players of the film. We're not going to explain the entire plot, but I just want to just set people up and be like, hey, there's a movie. We should know roughly what it's about. And what it's about is a lot of things. Okay, there's a family at the center of all of this. The mother is Perfidia. She's played by Tiana Taylor, who is a part of a resistance group. They're called the French 75. Her husband is Bob, played by Leonardo DiCaprio. Then they have a daughter, Willa. She's played in her teenage years by Chase Infinity. That's the family. Quickly, Rad, what do we need to know about this family and the French 75 and like what's going on here?
I mean, look, so Bob, well, you know, most of the movie is about him being this burnt out pothead, the father struggling to raise his 16-year-old daughter, but a former radical revolutionary as part of the French 75. And, you know, he's kind of an emblem of like, you know, what happens to a revolutionary when they get old and get disillusioned and kind of lose a sense of purpose, or their purpose now becomes raising a kid, so protecting and providing for a child instead of trying to save the world. But then the world comes crashing back into Bob and his daughter Willa's life when this former foe, played by Sean Penn, this kind of white supremacist U.S. military colonel, comes after them. And then the whole movie then becomes this sort of Terminator 2 style chase movie through the modern era.
Right. First of all, that was incredibly brief and a beautiful description. Thank you for that. You did a great job. Jackson, okay, over to the other side. You want to describe who Stephen Lockjaw is. So let's talk, that's the Sean Penn character. Who are the Christmas Adventurers Club? What's their deal?
That's a great question. No, I mean, Rad mentioned as well how this is kind of like a burnt out character. Bob Ferguson, in his earlier days, was more of a streamlined radical. In those years, Sean Penn's character, Colonel Stephen Lockjaw, was on their heels. He's this military guy. He wants to capture them. 15, 16 years down the line, he's still trying to get to them. He's the person that kind of crashes back into their lives. What he wants more than anything else is to get into the good graces of the Christmas Adventurers Club. They're this kind of satirical, but also eerily realistic white supremacist group pulling all the strings behind the scenes. They are the presidents. They are the politicians. They are the guys who worship Christmas.
Okay, first of all, that's again, beautiful description. I have to imagine that there's somebody listening to this saying, sounds like a bit of a wild romp. Like this idea of like you watch this movie. After you saw the movie, you described it as both great and perverse, which is two adjectives that don't often go together. And then you said also that the first 45 minutes was an uncomfortable watch for you as a Black woman. Why was that?
Well, because of the blending of sexuality and violence, which is at the heart of America. And I think this movie does very well in showing that America's violence is not only rooted in violent action, but in a particular perverse relationship to race and to Black women in particular. But for the first time, you have to understand I'm watching this in IMAX, first of all, because that's where the preview was. So like when Sean Penn is like licking his lips and doing this thing he does, which is a brilliant performance, but I just viscerally was literally cringing in my chair and I was just so revolted. And at some point, the person behind me goes, ugh, you picked this movie, you weirdo.
You did this to yourself.
I mean, that's what's brilliant about the movie. And I think had I not been in the theater, I might have actually had to turn away because watching as a Black woman, which really deals with the kind of dual disgust and desire that America has towards Blackness and towards, revolutionary fervor and towards otherness, that is really front and center in the first part. So we have a Black woman's body, a Black woman's sexuality. We have characters named quite like viscerally. I don't think I can say it live on CBC, some of the names. And so dealing with that in your face, which again, I think the movie's making such an important commentary on, but I just found it like extremely uncomfortable, but in an important way. I think it really gets to, in this satiric way, in a way that's funny, in a way that's over the top, but also I think it's a very serious political movie in that sense. And I will say that what I like about it as a movie is it doesn't do that vague thing about politics. A lot of movies want the guise of politics, but they want to shy away from what the politics actually are. This is a movie that has you rooting for the revolution. You want the people to succeed. You want to see the stuff blown up. You want to see ICE and all the people destroyed. And so I think that's the side that gives you a rush, but you have to also deal with some deep discomfort.
I want to come back to that point about ICE in just a moment, but also I just want to just stay with this commentary about race. So Perfidia, the mother and the revolutionary in this movie, she's really sexualized in that first part of the movie that you're talking about. And it's worth adding, again, like this is a movie that has a multiracial family in the center of it, and it's sort of trying to make that political point. White dad, a black mom, and a biracial daughter. How do you think that layers the story, Elle?
I think part of the movie, again, despite I don't want to make it sound like a serious documentary. We have a very funny scene, for example, of Leonardo DiCaprio watching Battle of Algiers, like word for word. So I think there's quite a lot of satire on the left in this movie as well.
Yeah.
But I think it is also a movie that, despite the violence, despite the absurdity of a lot of it, is also about don't give up hope. I think at the heart of it is this idea that, we cannot just sit here and believe that this fascist world is imploding on us. There's nothing we can do. We have to stand by. So you have both, the sort of outsized violence, but then also the idea that people do find ways, whether it's rescuing other migrants, whether it's, saving your family, whether it's finding love as the bombs go off. I think there's this really beautiful multiracial, multi-class story at the center of the movie that is about why we endure all of this and how we fight back.
I think what I love about Paul Thomas Anderson in general, Jackson, is that his movies tend to be like beautifully novelistic. Like the sort of the layers are kind of apparent and there for you to sort of like spend time with. And in that context, like picking something like the Christmas Adventurers Club, this sort of white supremacist society, sort of like have them be this kind of force through this movie. Like how does white supremacy and Santa, how do they go together as they sort of like build this a counterweight, so to speak, to the revolutionaries?
I mean, and it's novelistic in a way that I think it's open for interpretation. And here's my interpretation, which everyone in this room might jump and dogpile me as getting totally wrong. But I think that the interpretation here is this movie is kind of like ridiculous, satirical, silly, but trying to show how absurdity is an element of our real lives. And in showing this perfidious, thank you, a group that is, has its tendrils in all aspects of American society, political theater, etc., while worshiping this idea of religion that is, through its symbolism, inherently American. I mean, they have this like scary backroom area where they have like these geese flying behind them. They like worship Santa Claus, the capitalist ideation outgrowth of Christianity. It reminds me of this book called American Jesus, in which the author makes the argument that the Christian movement in America has reinterpreted the idea of Christianity, of Jesus Christ, to be able to worship America itself. And this kind of worshiping of something as ridiculous as Santa Claus, as ridiculous as Christmas, I kind of take as a way to say this is what America and the powers that be are trying to worship, are trying to instill, are trying to say is the most important thing, and trying to show how ridiculous we actually look in reality. Because for how the American power structure kind of worships itself in this movie's interpretation, it's just as ridiculous as if they worshipped Santa Claus as their central kind of figure.
First of all, I don't think anyone's going to jump on you for that interpretation. That was very thoughtful. That was great. So I think you're safe. Rad, this is where your WrestleMania comes into play. Okay, and I mean that because critics keep sort of talking about the idea of like this being like this is Paul Thomas Anderson at his best, but also Paul Thomas Anderson at maybe his most political. Particularly because it is landing in a year of a bunch of high-profile political shootings. Like we could talk about the Trump campaign, Trump getting shot while he was campaigning, the Minnesota Democrat Melissa Hortman, who was assassinated in June, of course, Charlie Kirk's assassination a few weeks back. But Paul Thomas Anderson is kind of distancing himself from all of that. He's not really willing to sort of explicitly say that. He recently said in an interview with a French newspaper that his film is, quote, an action comedy, very far from reality. I'm just trying to sell movie tickets for a fiction movie. And I go, PTA, we've seen your other movies, man. I don't think that's true. But what do you think? Is this movie as political as we are interpreting it to be? Or is it that it's landing in the middle of a really heightened, acute time?
No, I mean, first of all, anything PTA says you have to take with a grain of salt. This guy will tell you he doesn't put a lot of thought into his movies, and yet he fusses over every single detail in his
Phantom Thread
movie.
was just like a weekend.
It's like, there's no more effort here than Adam Sandler's Big Daddy. He'll tell you, right? Like,
Big Daddy's a great movie. I will not have Adam Sandler's slander of this day.
But of course, this movie is a political movie because I mean, when you talk about this movie as a big action spectacle, I mean, the big action set piece of this movie takes place against what is essentially like a massive ICE-like raid on a community, and a lot of the violence is you're seeing like this racist U.S. military colonel put in counterinsurgents among a protest so that the riot police can respond violently. Like it's you don't accidentally mirror our times so authentically. You know what I mean?
Perfectly.
Yeah. And then also like there's those layers. Like when Jackson's talking about this Christmas Adventurers Club, it's like in this movie, white supremacists, they don't wear neo-Nazi flags. They are dressed up. They celebrate Santa Claus and they wear Patagonia and Lacoste shirts and stuff, right? Like that is, and so it is a deeply political movie. It feels that way, but it's not Paul Thomas Anderson making statements, right? Because I think that's too easy for him, right? Because I think he's more interested in the humanity and the psychology among characters who are either reacting to the political environment or are informed by it. And so yes, this movie you think of like these political ideas of like the fetishization of radicalism, right? Especially to what Elle was talking about earlier, where it's like there's a seductiveness to activism that he's critical of. There's this generational thing that he's dealing with between the Leonardo DiCaprio character and the new generation of activism. So he grounds his politics in humanity, and he's done that throughout all his movies. I mean, you look at There Will Be Blood, The Master, and Inherent Vice. You have this trilogy of America in the 20th century, and it's about these personalities and how they're informed, how they're informed by the traumas and the power struggles of their time. And Inherent Vice, by the way, being like another Pynchon adaptation that, I think people don't realize he's a very political filmmaker.
I should say this movie is loosely an adaptation of another Pynchon.
Yeah. But I mean, a lot of his movies are set in the past. So that's why people don't see the direct political relation to now, right? Whereas, even though like those ideas are often speaking to now. And so, and this movie just feels more direct. But if you look at a movie like Inherent Vice, where a lot of the same ideas here about like the romanticization of idealism and how that all falls apart and gets co-opted by authoritarianism, like that's all there in Inherent Vice, and that speaks just as much to now. That was a huge Trump era rewatch, right? But in this story, it is ultimately like this father-daughter story, and it's about finding hope in that future generation.
Well, to Rad's point, Elle, there's a collision, right? There's a collision between family and politics at a certain point, and he's been actually trying to work through that since There Will Be Blood, right? Like that's a movie ultimately about what you inherit, what you inherit from your parents, generationally, but also politically, but also just like philosophically speaking. How do you see that collision playing out in One Battle After Another?
First of all, I do want to go back for a minute to the idea of satire, which you've been talking about, because I think satire is the only political response in this moment. Like everything that you might have satirized 20 years ago, the Trump regime has gone further than that. Who would have thought that a reality show host would be president of the United States and that every day would bring us some new cruelty and horror, but couched in such absurdity. So it seems that the only way to respond to it is also through political satire. And so I think that hits perfectly in this moment. And that also, I think, about family making happens within that. So the action film itself is such an American idea, right? So there's a particular shot I'm thinking of after the car chases. I don't want to wreck the story, but at the ending, there's a chase, and then we get what would normally be the hero shot, but it's not. That really references us back to Terminator. And I think it's recalling to us that all of these images that we've had of films of masculinity, of American soldiers, are being undone in this film. And they're undone by a 16-year-old girl in a certain extent, right? Who is able to push back. And they're undone by a father who's in some ways, completely neglectful of his responsibility, just is trying anyway. And even, I think film is even in some ways gentle towards a mother who ultimately abandons her child for her vision of freedom, but actually in that sense can be sympathetic to. So I think that in this sort of big mess that is America, that is interfering with our family values, that is interfering in all these levels that white American supremacy and nationalism wants to get their tendrils into, without being so serious and severe about it, this movie is saying there are places where we push back. We push back with humor, we push back with love, we push back in saving each other, and we save each other in these unexpected ways. And again, it's not done in this like schmaltzy way, but I don't think we can help but see that message. So again, it's a movie that I just think ultimately is unapologetically saying like, go Antifa. Like, let's go for it. And in this moment, I think that's also extremely like bracing.
You don't get a lot of movies that say that explicitly, I don't think. I will say, Jackson, to that point that Al just made, this idea of, okay, first of all, we mentioned that this is an adaptation of a Pynchon novel that you're currently holding, because I've never seen you watch a movie based on a novel and not bring the novel into the conversation and just like hold it physically in person. But regardless of anything that Paul Thomas Anderson is saying, you're like, hey, I just made a fun action movie, guys. I don't know what you're talking about. Right? Obviously, you don't. That's his thing to say, and he often will kind of say that. Ultimately, here, like, do you think this movie is this cautionary tale reflection of the time that we're in right now?
I will say that I don't think we can totally discount his I wanted to make an action movie. He said that really this idea germinated with the idea of making a movie about a car chase. And I mean, Paul Thomas Anderson actually dropped out of film school because his professors did not give Terminator 2 the proper respect. So he said, these guys don't know what they're talking about. I'm going to go make movies that respect Terminator.
And he's right.
Which this movie does.
Yeah.
I do think that this movie is adapted, as we've been talking about, from Violent, a book that's rooted in 60s countercultural violence, brought up to the 80s Reagan years, in which that's been co-opted and destroyed by COINTELPRO, etc. This is a movie that kind of exists in an eternal present. There is this gap between when they were the French 75 that everyone cared about, and then 15 years later, they're kind of dying off. But it's kind of in this eternal 2020 sort of miasma of time. And it's not as rooted as the book is, with the Weather Underground, with the FLQ, with the BLA, the Symbionese Liberation Army, these real groups that actually did bomb courtrooms, rob banks, and as Asad Shakur did, murder police officers. This is more about kind of like, this is how it feels to be disconnected from your ability to resist, to mount opposition, and how we can still find hope and loyalty within one another, even as almost every character, whether they're on the left or the right in this movie, is destroyed by a system. So I do think that he is, as Rad has mentioned, not necessarily making a political argument, but is making a movie that really tries to encapsulate how hopeless it can feel to exist in this over-indexed government that is taking over every aspect of individuality. I wish it went a little bit further in making a clear argument. Something that I also kind of felt, I love There Will Be Blood. It's adapted from Oil, adapted from a book called Oil by Upton Sinclair, who himself was so politically active. His book, The Jungle, founded the FDA. And the movie itself doesn't necessarily go in that very clear leftist ideation. This movie as well is kind of more miasma, not necessarily making a specific argument in my opinion, but it does encapsulate the political feeling of this moment. So it has to be.
I think, first of all, it's not easy to make a movie where people feel so powerless that they resort to violence to seize control, because that's a really radical sentiment to begin with, right? Like just the idea that you make a movie about that and say, hey, can this movie go all the way to maybe win Best Picture? That's not a common, sort of Best Picture winning theme around here. Having said that, Rad, just real quick to you, people are already saying, hey, this is going to be his first Oscar for best director. We kind of see that we're headed there. Do you think that's true?
I think it's almost a foregone conclusion, and partly
it is September, my guy.
But it's like, but it's like the thing is, it's partly because yes, this is the best American movie of the year, if not years, but also because he's overdue. This would be like his Departed moment, right? Like when
Martin Scorsese finally gets it for The Departed, when
not for his best movie, The
Departed is pretty good.
It's pretty good, but it's like it's Scorsese's most entertaining movie. Same with One Battle After Another. I don't think this holds a candle to like The Master, Inherent Vice, and Phantom Thread. I mean, it's close, but it's what I love about this movie is I think there's a divide. There's two different PTA fans, right? There's the ones who love his earlier work, like Magnolia and Boogie Nights, which are more entertaining, and then the people like me who think that stuff was warm up.
You like the cerebral stuff.
The Master, Inherent Vice. So this movie feels like it's uniting the two PTAs, and it's like the best of both worlds because you got the mastery of his late career, but the accessibility and the streamlined entertainment of the earlier fireworks. So I'd be excited to finally see this happen for him.
All right. My name is Elamin Abdelmahmoud, and this is Commotion. Radheyan Simonpillai is here. Al Jones is here, and Jackson Reaver is here. And before I let you guys go, I just want to talk about this controversy that is happening this week. Let me just roll this clip right now.
It's gonna be a coordinated mass attack.
Blood will be shed.
Locked and loaded. Been planted for months.
The hunt has begun.
This guy isn't just planning violence. He's out to make a statement.
What kind of a statement?
The kind that history refers to with a month and a date.
That's from the trailer of The Savant. That's a show about domestic terrorism starring Jessica Chastain. It was supposed to come out this week. And then Apple TV Plus said, you know what, we're going to delay the release. They've not provided an official reason for pressing pause, but a lot of people are speculating that their decision is kind of related to the shooting death of right-wing activist Charlie Kirk. I want to talk about this real quick because we have like 4 minutes here. But Jessica Chastain has kind of spoken out about this decision. What did she say?
I mean, she said that she doesn't agree with Apple's decision, and then she cited like a litany of kind of violent acts across the political spectrum, like pointing to January 6th, the attempted assassination of Donald Trump, and then of course Charlie Kirk's shooting, and stressed that because of that, like that's why this show is important to be. It's important for this show to be seen because it deals with the people who work to infiltrate and preempt the kind of people that that carry out those types of attacks.
Right. Jackson, you've actually seen a couple episodes, but now you can never talk about them because the show is not coming out anytime soon. What can you tell us about what The Savant is about without any sort of, violating the embargo?
Very generally, it's about a woman who is posing as right-wing agitators, and she's getting in those groups, trying to identify them before they can make attacks. But it's also about the proliferation of right-wing ideals to her own children, to the people around her. And it does kind of show a dichotomy between the public-facing message from some of these right-wing agitators and what's going on behind the scenes, which can be in the show a little bit more violent.
El, we talked about, we just talked about One Battle After Another, a movie that is politically, about the moment that we're in. And then now we've got the show postponed, likely due to the political moment that we're also in. How do you reflect on, how does that make you think about, how art and storytelling are maybe vehicles for how are reflecting our times right now?
Yeah, I mean, I have long had a rant about late capitalist stage art and like why we're constantly only getting nostalgia and remakes of remakes and sequels to sequels, as if there's no new stories to be told. And we see how searing story could be with One Battle After Another, not least because of this kind of mockery of white supremacy. The idea of putting forth on the big screen, America hates you because they desire you sexually. These are really detonating ideas. And so story and narrative is actually very dangerous to the exact powers that we're talking about. So it doesn't actually surprise me that part of what we see in this moment with authoritarianism isn't just snatching people off the streets. It isn't just funding weapons for war and genocide. It's also shutting down the avenues we have to critique it and think about it and talk about it. And that's what art actually does, is it allows us these vehicles to argue about these things, to get new ideas, to be uncomfortable in the theater. And so it actually doesn't surprise me in this moment where we've seen Jimmy Kimmel pushed off the air, people being fired for, just not celebrating Charlie Kirk's death in the correct way. As these forces gather in all these ways, that it would also be like, you're not going to get to watch this show that might actually prompt you to think in some way about political violence. So I think this is exactly why, to go back to the movie, something like this movie is important in this moment, even just for enjoyment. It doesn't have to be taken seriously, but the fact that we can still enjoy and watch and have conversation is actually a lot of the antithesis to the very forces that we want to push back on.
There is some precedent, I want to say, for postponing a TV show or an episode. Back to the 90s, Buffy the Vampire Slayer delayed an episode after the tragic shooting events at Columbine High School because there was a school shooting in that episode of Buffy. This show was pushed from September 12th because that was too close to 9/11. And that was being delayed indefinitely without really a clear response from Apple. I got like maybe 45 seconds left here, right? But how do you feel about the lack of transparency that we're getting?
I mean, look, it doesn't surprise me, right?
Okay.
And partly because I don't know that Apple putting out a statement would necessarily help them win in this case, because we saw what happened with Jimmy Kimmel, and we saw how Brendan Carr and Trump painted his comments into him trying to place some blame on MAGA, and you can in terms of the Charlie Kirk shooting, and you could imagine the same thing coming out of this show. It doesn't surprise me for Apple because I don't know if you remember when Killers of the Flower Moon was on its awards tour, and Robert De Niro was going to give this speech where he goes on on one of his typical anti-Trump tirades, but then the speech was altered in the prompter, and he's like, what's going on? And then he read it off his phone, his original version, that said, shame on Apple. He blamed Apple and Apple's reps. So they get weak in the knees when it comes to this kind of stuff. So it doesn't surprise me that they're getting weak in the knees now.
I think that's a good place to leave it. I appreciate your time. You guys are the best. Thank you so much for this. Really
Thank
appreciate
you.
it.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Thank you. Elle Jones is a poet and assistant professor at the Department of Politics at Mount St. Vincent University in Halifax. Jackson Weaver is a senior writer at CBC Entertainment. And Radheyan Simonpillai is a general menace, but also he's a freelance film critic in Toronto. You can find his work at the Globe and Mail, on CTV, and right here on Commotion. My name is Elamin Abdelmahmoud. This show is called Commotion. We'll be back on Monday. Hey, I hope you have a great weekend. We'll see you then.